Midsplatternight Pictures began back in 2003 as a local horror film festival in Belgium, co-owned and operated by Wesley Remory. Wesley and others initially aimed to promote independent filmmakers and their works within Belgium, but many years later, Wesley and crew decided to try their hand at making a horror film of their own. But Wesley didn't want to make just any by-the-numbers horror film. In fact, he turned hell-bent on making a love letter to the weird and gory shot-on-video movies of the 80s, as well as paying tribute to the late great Italian filmmaker Lucio Fulci. And ultimately, Wesley decided to do so with a project called Maggot Farmers. The story of Maggot Farmers is very simple. There's an old woman in a cloak performing a sinister ritual. She casts spells, buries voodoo dolls into a pot of soil, and then cuts her hand, spilling her blood into the soil. Meanwhile, a group of men are kidnapping and butchering women for their meals and using their organs to feed the maggots. But little do they know that the dead are being resurrected and that they are merely fodder for the undead. The original version of Maggot Farmers was written and began to materialize as early as 2009, with Wesley writing the script and setting up effects. But as it turns out, the production and culmination of Maggot Farmers as a whole was cursed from the very beginning. With the cast and crew's availability constantly changing, on top of bad weather, very little filmmaking experience, and very little footage, the production of the original Maggot Farmers was cancelled in 2011. But Midsplatternight's foray into film didn't end there. Over the next decade, they stirred up a considerable buzz with atmospheric short works such as Prognosticum, Forbiddenness, and their second most recent work, the infamous Disgust. Despite the success that his shorts saw, Wesley could not forget about Maggot Farmers. It just kept haunting him. He had to tell this story. He had to realize his vision. So in 2019, Maggot Farmers was rewritten, and with more experience under their belt, the Midsplatternight crew went back into production on the film. But just like its original incarnation, this production was plagued from the very beginning. Aside from audio recordings being lost or ruined, issues with crew vehicles and special effects malfunctioning, the biggest curse of the production was the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. Because of the scare, once more, the production of Maggot Farmers was delayed indefinitely. But through patience, stubbornness, and perseverance, Wesley and crew pulled through and finished Maggot Farmers in late 2021. And now, this twisted vision of ritualistic undead mayhem could be unleashed onto the populace. Maggot Farmers wears its influence on its sleeve, but it also stands head and shoulders above other homages to old-school horror. Whereas many different tributes to 80s horror often fail to recapture what made such movies so special by overusing genre tropes, Maggot Farmers is much more reserved and well-structured. The story, while simple and very short, is told effectively and with very little dialogue. There's maybe 2 scenes that have any dialogue, and it boils down to simple exchanges. But Maggot Farmers doesn't need dialogue to tell its story, and the filmmakers prove this by working wonders with the visuals. The camera work and the lighting both play a huge role in setting the atmosphere. The lighting isn't too dull or too colorful. There's heavy use of soft yellow and orange tints, and when the zombies are on screen, they're aided by this eerie blue glow that just really made me uneasy. The actors do a pretty good job considering the rather simple characters they have to work with. There's an especially impressive effects sequence where a character is lit on fire and writhes around in agony, a la Olaf Ittenbach's The Burning Moon. My hat goes off to the person brave enough to actually commit to such a stunt, especially on a production with such a low budget. But despite the low budget, the movie is just so well made overall, including its special effects. While not a total gore fest, Maggot Farmers has some especially impressive gore and zombie makeup. The zombies look really creepy and are truly reminiscent of Lucio Fulci's Zombie 2. All things considered, the only complaints I have are minor sound mix issues, but those are so trivial they may as well not be mentioned at all. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect going into Maggot Farmers, considering I've never seen anything from its studio before. I do, however, remember when Disgust was first released, and it was receiving a lot of praise from horror fanatics. I was intrigued, but at the time, I was a broke 17-year-old kid with no money, and alas, I never had a chance to see anything from the studio. But now that I've seen Maggot Farmers, I'm curious to see what else they have, because this was a very well done short, and I suggest that you jump at it as soon as you can. This is an 80s horror throwback worth watching and revisiting. On a side note, One thing that I loved is that during the end credits, we also get to see what survives of the original 2011 Maggot farmers. It really is interesting to see how the movie has evolved over the decade it took to complete, and it's even better to see that despite all of the hardships, Wesley Remory never gave up on his vision. So why should anyone else give up on theirs?